The fog arrived in London not as a polite shroud, but as a suffocating, grey beast, swallowing the familiar angles of the city whole. On this evening in October 1888, it clung to Fleet Street like a damp, ill-fitting coat, turning the glow of the gaslights into sickly yellow halos. The usual sounds of the metropolis, the clip-clop of hansoms, the distant rumble of the omnibus, the cries of the evening newsman, were muffled and distorted, lending the entire thoroughfare an unsettling, aqueous silence. In the very heart of this gloom stood Arthur Penhaligon, the blind fiddler. His usual spot was by the wrought-iron fence of St. Bride's Church, a place he knew by the smell of aged stone and the slight draught that always seemed to funnel between the tall buildings. Arthur was not a polished musician. His suit was threadbare, his bowler hat permanently dented, and his sight had been stolen years ago by a forgotten tragedy. Yet, when the bow met the strings of his old violin, a truth emerged that transcended mere street performance. His music was not for alms. It was a desperate, articulate conversation with the darkness that permanently encased him. Tonight, however, the conversation was one of frantic urgency. His playing was usually steeped in melancholy, drawing out tears or quiet sympathy, but tonight it held a frantic, almost violent edge. The melody was a twisting, complex thing, a cascade of minor chords that seemed to chase a higher, unreachable note. His fingers danced over the fingerboard with a speed that defied his age and his ragged appearance. The music felt like a warning, a desperate telegraph sent through the heavy air. He swayed slightly, his sightless eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his hat brim, appearing to strain against the fog, as if trying to pierce the gloom not with light, but with sound. The damp cold had penetrated his thin coat, but he seemed oblivious to it, lost entirely within the escalating drama of his own playing. Every stroke of the bow was laden with a profound, consuming dread. It was the sound of someone running through a dense, unseen labyrinth, trying to escape a predator that was neither seen nor heard, but keenly felt. The air around him seemed to grow colder with the intensity of his performance, a small, unnatural vortex carved into the oppressive Fleet Street fog. Passers-by who were hurrying home slowed down, compelled by the sheer, raw panic woven into the notes. Arthur was building to a crescendo, a final, screaming declaration. He was not just playing for the coins in the open case at his feet. He was playing for his life, or perhaps, for the life of his sanity. The strings groaned under the pressure of his bow, the sound becoming almost a metallic shriek, pushing against the thick silence of the night. He lifted his head, a single bead of sweat tracing a path down his grey temple, his entire focus fixed on an invisible point just beyond the mouth of a narrow, particularly dark alleyway across the street. The melody was at its breaking point, a furious, final attempt to complete a sentence that should never be spoken. Arthur Penhaligon's regular audience was a tableau of Victorian London's varied classes, each individual drawn by a strange, almost voyeuristic fascination with his sorrowful music. They were the constants in his shifting, sonic world. Nearest to him stood Mr. Silas Harrington, a tall, rigid gentleman whose attire, a perfectly tailored black overcoat and silk top hat, spoke of financial success and emotional austerity. Harrington never dropped a coin, but he never failed to stop, his face a mask of stern contemplation, as though Arthur's despair somehow validated his own reserved life. He stood now, hands clasped behind his back, a human monument carved of disapproval and grim interest, positioned just outside the reach of the lamplight. To the right were the Farnsworth sisters, Eliza and Clara. They were clad in heavy velvet and lace, armed with large, elaborate fans that were more for subtle social signaling than for cooling. They always approached with an air of delicate pity, whispering judgments on Arthur's frayed cuffs and the obvious hardship of his life before dropping a single, gleaming shilling into his case. Tonight, their fans remained closed, pressed to their chests. Their usual cascade of hushed gossip had dried up. They stood unnaturally close together, their eyes darting nervously towards the dark, fog-choked alley across the street. The final member of the quartet was a young boy, no older than 10, named Thomas. He was an urchin, a phantom of the London streets, who always appeared as silently as the fog. Unlike the others, Thomas was truly captivated, his dirty face lifted towards Arthur, his entire small frame vibrating with the intensity of the music. Tonight, however, Thomas was not just listening. He was visibly distressed. He kept clutching the frayed collar of his own tunic, and shifting his gaze from the fiddler to the surrounding shadows, a movement suggesting he was listening for something other than the violin. The tension they all felt was palpable, a shared, silent acknowledgement that tonight's performance was different. It wasn't just Arthur's desperation, it was the unnatural stillness of the street itself. The usual sounds had not just been muffled by the fog, they had ceased entirely. No distant coach wheels, no drunken shouts from the nearby public house, not even the scuttling of rats in the gutter. It was as if the fog had absorbed all ambient noise, leaving only the frantic, soaring, and ultimately solitary sound of Arthur's fiddle. This profound silence, broken only by the violin, intensified the feeling of isolation. It felt like the four witnesses and the fiddler had been separated from the rest of the world, marooned on a small, slippery island of cobblestone and lamplight. The fog seemed to press in, thick and suffocating, making every breath a shallow struggle. The air was charged with a premonition, a feeling that the melody Arthur was so furiously pursuing was leading them all to an abrupt, terrible revelation. The audience stood poised, rigid, awaiting the final catastrophic note of the street musician's terrifying symphony. Arthur was nearing the climax of his frantic piece. The music was now a breathless, chaotic sprint, a sound that pushed the ancient wood of his violin to its very limits. He reached for that final highest note, the note he'd been chasing through the sonic fog, the one that seemed to hold the key to the terror that gripped him. His bow scraped across the strings with a sound that was less music and more a raw, metallic scream, a sound of absolute, agonizing defeat. Then, silence. The sudden cessation of the music was a physical jolt to the waiting audience. Mr. Harrington visibly flinched. The Farnsworth sisters let out a synchronized, sharp intake of breath. Arthur stood perfectly still, his chest heaving, his left hand gripping the neck of the violin with white-knuckled intensity. The thick, unnatural silence of Fleet Street rushed back in, now amplified by the abrupt end of the sound that had held it at bay. It was in that absolute void of noise that the second, and far more terrifying, sound occurred. It did not come from Arthur's violin, nor did it come from the street itself. It erupted from the mouth of the black alleyway directly opposite, the one Arthur's sightless eyes had been so fiercely focused on. It was a shriek, not human, not animal, but a sound so purely devoid of life, and yet so full of suffering that it froze the blood in their veins. It was sharp, piercing, and brief, like the snap of a wire pulled too taut, yet it seemed to echo for minutes in the dense fog. The scream was immediately followed by a cold, violent gust of wind that defied the stillness of the night. It felt icy and unnatural, smelling faintly of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt sugar. The sudden localized gale whipped down the street, causing the gaslight nearest Arthur to sputter violently before the mantel cracked and the light extinguished itself, plunging the fiddler and his small audience into an overwhelming, choking darkness. In the sudden profound blackness, a collective, stifled gasp went up from the group. The Farnsworth sisters clung to each other, their whispers silenced by pure terror. The only thing that broke the ensuing heart-stopping quiet was the soft, muffled thud of Arthur Penhaligon's old bowler hat hitting the cobblestones. The wind died as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a silence more absolute than before, heavy with the weight of unseen horror. They stood paralyzed, awaiting the return of the light, trapped in the oppressive cold that had replaced the fog's usual dampness. The darkness that followed the shriek and the abrupt failure of the gaslight was absolute, a crushing blanket that smothered vision and instilled primal panic. The small crowd, seconds ago united by a shared melody, was now scattered and helpless in the sudden void. They held their breath, listening with agonizing intensity for any sound, a footstep, a moan, or the terrifying return of the alley's scream. The air remained unnaturally cold, carrying a faint, metallic odor that seemed to catch in the throat. It was Mr. Harrington, the stern gentleman, who finally broke the paralysis. Driven perhaps by a sense of Victorian propriety that outweighed his fear, he fumbled inside his coat for a box of matches. The scraping sound of sulfur against flint seemed deafeningly loud in the oppressive silence. He struck one, and the tiny, defiant flare of light was a profoundly welcome sight. The match illuminated the scene in a fleeting, flickering orange glow. The Farnsworth sisters, still clutching each other, let out a small, terrified cry. The light revealed Arthur Penhaligon not standing, but slumped entirely over his instrument. He lay face down on the wet, uneven cobblestones. His body was splayed out, his head resting in the shallow depression of his open violin case, amidst the few meager coins he had collected. His right hand still held the bow, which had fallen across the shoulder of his jacket, and his left hand was still desperately gripping the neck of his violin. The instrument itself was partially crushed beneath his chest, a pathetic soundless victim of his collapse. His usual slouch of weary resignation was gone, replaced by a posture of final, catastrophic surrender. His hat lay a few inches from his face, and the exposed side of his head was pale, almost ashen, catching the weak light. Crucially, there was no blood. No sign of a struggle, no overturned chair, no defensive wound. He looked less like a victim of violence, and more like a man who had simply been struck down by a monstrous, invisible exhaustion. The match sputtered and died, plunging them into darkness once more. Harrington, his voice rough with shock, managed a strained order. "Someone fetch a constable, and another light. Quickly." But the young boy, Thomas, did not move to run. When Harrington finally managed to light a second match, Thomas was still standing near the scene, his eyes fixed not on the dead fiddler, but on the mouth of the alley. He stepped back slowly, as if withdrawing from an invisible tether, his small mouth working as he tried to speak, his gaze conveying a knowledge that was far too large and terrible for his young age. The third match struck by Mr. Harrington finally held its flame steady, illuminating the dreadful tableau for the third and most chilling time. The flickering light cast dancing shadows that seemed to mock the solemnity of the dead fiddler. The Farnsworth sisters were dissolving into panicked, muffled sobs, and Harrington, his composure finally fractured, was shouting into the fog for a passing constable. But all eyes, eventually, turned to Thomas. The young boy hadn't budged. He stood a mere few feet from Arthur's lifeless form, his slight body rigid and his gaze fixed, not on the body, but toward the gaping black maw of the alleyway. When Harrington's frantic cries failed to rouse any help, the gentleman turned to Thomas, intending to roughly dispatch the boy for assistance. "Run, boy. Run and find the nearest policeman. Did you not hear me?" Harrington's voice was sharp, a desperate attempt to regain control of the terrifying situation. Thomas didn't move. He simply turned his head slowly, his eyes wide and vacant, as though still seeing the image of the shriek that had emanated from the darkness. His usual street urchin resilience was completely gone, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked terror. "It didn't come from a person, sir," Thomas whispered, his voice a raw, thin sound barely audible above the sputtering gaslight. It was what he was playing." The Farnsworth sisters fell silent, their tears forgotten in the face of the boy's strange, immediate certainty. Harrington knelt down, gripping the boy's shoulders with a desperate intensity. "What are you talking about, child? He was playing a song. Did you see anyone flee that alley?" Thomas shook his head vehemently. "No one fled. No one was there. He knew it was coming. His fingers, they were running, sir. Running away from the sound. But it wasn't behind him. It was in the music." The boy's words were laced with an unsettling conviction that defied logic. He pointed a trembling finger at the still, sightless face of Arthur Penhaligon. "When the music stopped and that other noise came out, the breaking noise, that was the sound of it catching him. He played the whole thing, sir. The whole story. And the last note snapped when he saw the end of the story." This was no ordinary witness testimony. It was the frantic, yet strangely clear, declaration of a child who believed he had witnessed a fatal confrontation between a man and an invisible, sonic horror. The other adults dismissed it as the nonsense of a frightened child, but for a lingering moment, standing over the dead fiddler in the deep fog of Fleet Street, they all felt a cold, prickling uncertainty. If there was no murderer, no assailant, then what force had squeezed the life from Arthur Penhaligon's heart? The young boy's horrifying whisper lingered in the cold, damp air. He saw it in his music. The arrival of Inspector Caldwell of Scotland Yard finally pierced the bubble of terror that had gripped the small audience. Caldwell was a methodical man, known for his relentless, sober pursuit of fact over fear. He arrived cloaked against the chilling fog, his face a landscape of professional weariness. The constables who accompanied him quickly erected a temporary cordon and lit the surrounding gaslights, banishing the worst of the shadows. Caldwell surveyed the scene with a practiced, dispassionate eye. Arthur Penhaligon's body still lay precisely as it had fallen, prone, cradling the damaged violin. The inspector knelt, ignoring the dampness of the cobblestones. The first and most unsettling fact was the complete lack of trauma. He gently examined the fiddler coat, neck, and hands. No bruises, no struggle marks, and crucially, no blood. Cause of death appears non-physical, Inspector, noted the attending police surgeon, Dr. Alastair Finch, who had just finished a preliminary examination. The heart simply ceased. I suspect fright, or a sudden, massive cardiac event. But I'll confirm that, at the morgue. Caldwell moved his attention to the immediate surroundings. The small coin case was open, but the contents, a few shillings and coppers, were untouched. This was no robbery. He glanced at the agitated witnesses. Mr. Harrington, now lecturing a constable on the dangers of street disorder, the Farnsworth sisters, still trembling, and the young boy, Thomas, who watched everything with a disturbing intensity. The inspector stooped to examine the violin. The instrument was old and well-loved, but the wood along the body was marked by several deep, fresh gouges. They weren't cuts, they were scores, as if the fiddler nails had desperately raked the wood in his final, blind moments. He noted the dark, looming alley across the street, the reported source of the terrifying shriek. "The case is perplexing, Doctor," Caldwell murmured, standing slowly. "A man dies of terror on a busy street, but no one saw the assailant, and there is no weapon. Only a scream that vanished into the fog." He pointed to the gouges on the violin, then to the wide, petrified eyes of the deceased. The final piece he played must have been a frantic one. The question is, what was he playing at? And what was playing him? He instructed a constable to collect the boy Thomas for a formal statement, certain the child's bizarre account was the only clue they currently possessed to the true nature of the horror on Fleet Street. Back at the station house, Inspector Caldwell focused his attention on the most compelling piece of physical evidence, Arthur Penhaligon's violin. It was a humble instrument, repaired many times, yet it possessed the deep, resonant hue that spoke of years of constant use. Caldwell had it placed carefully on his desk beneath a strong lamp, examining it as if it were a coded document. The damage was immediately apparent and highly significant. The most obvious injury was where Arthur's weight had partially crushed the instrument upon collapse. But far more telling was the cluster of scratches and gouges centered near the bridge and tailpiece, the area where the musician's right hand would rest during intense playing. These marks were not the result of the fall. They were fresh, clean breaks in the varnish and wood. Caldwell ran a gloved finger over the deepest mark. It was irregular, ragged, and ended abruptly. It wasn't the work of a dropped object or an external weapon. The marks were precisely what one would expect if a person, in a moment of extreme panic, had dug their own fingernails into the instrument's body. The fiddler hadn't just been playing a frantic tune. He had been physically clawing at his means of expression, a desperate attempt to stop the very sound he was producing. He was trying to silence it, Caldwell muttered to himself. Not just the music, but whatever the music was drawing to him. He picked up a smaller, leather-bound notebook recovered from Arthur's pocket, which was not a music book, but a simple ledger of daily takings. Turning the pages, Caldwell found several entries on the day of the death. £0/0/4, £0/0/2, £0/0/6. But on the very last page, under the entry for that night, there was no tally. Instead, scrawled in a hasty, almost illegible hand, were three recurring words. "It returns. Fast. Closer." The inspector leaned back, the image of the dead man's terrified, sightless face swimming in his mind. The scratches on the fiddle told a story of last-moment, agonizing fear. The ledger confirmed that Arthur was aware of something malevolent approaching. The notes weren't just musical, they were a countdown. Caldwell pushed the violin aside, rubbing his temples. A man killed by terror, witnessed by a child claiming a sonic killer, and documented by frantic scars on a wooden instrument. This was not a murder for the Old Bailey. This was a nightmare delivered to the doorstep of Scotland Yard. He knew he needed to understand the man, Arthur Penhaligon, before he could hope to understand the creature that had killed him. Inspector Caldwell began his formal interviews, starting with the most outwardly composed, yet least cooperative, witness, Mr. Silas Harrington. Caldwell met the wealthy financier in his opulent office in the city, a room heavy with the scent of old leather and self-importance. Harrington's account was meticulous, precise, and utterly devoid of emotion, a careful recitation of facts designed to distance himself from the vulgarity of the street death. "I stopped as I always do," Harrington stated, adjusting his cufflink. "The man was a fixture of the street. I found his music acceptable, though overly dramatic. On that night, however, his playing was, frankly, disturbing. A frenzy." Caldwell pressed him on the transition from music to silence. "You stated you heard the shriek from the alley. Can you describe it?" Harrington steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on a point just above the inspector's head. "It was sharp, unpleasant, not human, certainly. Like a mechanical failure, perhaps. A sound of something breaking." He paused, a flicker of something close to distaste crossing his rigid face. "I turned immediately, but the gaslight failed. I saw nothing but darkness and fog." "And the fiddler?" Caldwell asked. "Did you see Mr. Penhaligon exhibit any sign of fear before the shriek?" "Fear? He was blind, Inspector. How would I know?" Harrington scoffed, then reconsidered. However, his bow arm was moving with a desperate violence I had never observed. He was sweating profusely, despite the bitter cold. He seemed less a musician and more a man trying to physically flee his own performance. When the music stopped, he simply collapsed. Crucially, Harrington was adamant that the fiddler's final piece of music was entirely new to him, a jumble of disjointed, ugly sounds. He dismissed the boy Thomas's claims about Arthur, seeing the horror in his music as the fanciful ramblings of a gutter snipe. The interview yielded a valuable piece of information: Harrington's precise, if cold, observation of Arthur's panic before the shriek, and his insistence on the music's unprecedented quality of violence. Harrington saw the death not as a murder, but as a kind of self-destruction driven by the fiddler's own frantic notes. Caldwell concluded that Harrington, though truthful about his observations, was hiding a deep-seated discomfort with the nature of the death. He feared the possibility of a non-human agency, a threat that proper Victorian society could not regulate. He saw only a man who played a tune so terrifying it stopped his own heart. But the inspector's attention remained fixed on the boy's whisper. Why did the fiddler play that terrifying piece? And what, precisely, was it that he was running from? The post-mortem examination, conducted in the chilly, sterile confines of the London morgue, only deepened Inspector Caldwell's disquiet. Dr. Alastair Finch, the police surgeon, looked frustrated, an expression that rarely suited his usually stoic countenance. "The findings are conclusive, Inspector, but defy a simple diagnosis," Dr. Finch reported, pushing a chart across the steel table. "Arthur Penhaligon's organs are, for a man of his hardship and age, remarkably sound. No signs of poisoning, no internal rupture, and, as we observed, no external contusions." Caldwell studied the report, which detailed a healthy man's body. "Then what, doctor, stopped the engine?" "The engine was commanded to stop," Finch stated grimly. "The heart simply failed. Complete, instantaneous asystole. It wasn't disease, it was trauma. But the trauma was not physical. It was a massive, sudden shock to the nervous system, a shock so profound it overrode all biological function." "You are suggesting he literally died of fright?" "Precisely. His body registered a level of terror entirely incompatible with life. Imagine, Inspector, encountering a sight, or hearing a sound, so unspeakably horrible that the brain, in a desperate act of self-preservation, chooses to simply pull the plug. Finch tapped the chart. The adrenaline levels were astronomical, but they were released into a system that was already shutting down. It's a paradox. The fight or flight response was triggered, but the fight was so utterly hopeless that the body defaulted to immediate cessation. Caldwell thought back to the claw marks on the violin and the boy's terrified whisper about the music. He was alive and playing 1 second, dead and silent the next. You find no evidence of pressure, no trace of a drug that would mimic this. None. He was simply scared to death, the surgeon confirmed. And the intensity of the collapse suggests the stimulus was incredibly close, incredibly sudden, and utterly unexpected by the man himself. It was a sensory attack of the highest order. The report dismissed the possibility of conventional murder, leaving Caldwell with a maddening truth. Arthur Penhaligon had been killed by something that existed outside the purview of the penal code. The weapon was invisible, and the wound was located in the soul. The inspector realized the pursuit of a human killer was a waste of time. He needed to identify the stimulus, the horrifying sight or sound that had shattered the fiddler heart. He was no longer investigating a murder, he was tracking a sonic haunting on the streets of London. With the post-mortem ruling out conventional violence, Inspector Caldwell treated the scene of the shriek, the dark, narrow alley opposite the church, as the key piece of evidence. He returned there late that afternoon, dispatching constables to rope off the entrance and setting his own lamp down on the slick, greasy cobbles at the mouth of the passage. The alley, a mere slit between 2 towering Victorian buildings, was a tunnel of perpetual shadow. It smelled of stale beer, damp mortar, and a peculiar faint scent Caldwell couldn't immediately identify, like old dust mixed with ozone. He instructed a constable to dust the ground with a fine layer of flour, hoping to capture the impression of anyone or anything that might have fled the scene after the fatal shriek. Caldwell walked slowly, his lamp throwing a weak circle of light along the brick walls. He reached the rear of the alley, where a few empty refuse bins lay scattered. The flour was spread uniformly over the path leading away from the street and back into the dark recess. When he examined the dusted surface, the findings were baffling. There were no fresh footprints. The flour was disturbed only by the ancient, embedded impressions of previous cartwheels and the small, delicate tracks of rats. There was no sign of a man's boot, a woman's heel, or even the small, ragged shoes of the boy Thomas. Whatever had produced that terrifying, heart-stopping sound had either vanished into thin air or had never been physically present at all. The shadow, if it was a shadow, had left no mark. "Inspector," called the constable, pointing his own lamp at a section of the wall near the street entrance. "Look here." Where the brick wall met the ground, a patch of the mortar and grime was disturbingly clean. It was a vertical smear, about waist-high, as if something wet, wide, and heavy had been dragged swiftly and forcefully up the wall, clearing the soot and dust in its path. It was an impossible trajectory for a fleeing man. Caldwell touched the clean patch. It was still faintly damp and sticky. He collected a sample, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. The evidence defied his experience. The death was real, the fear was real, the sound was attested to by multiple witnesses, but the source was immaterial. He stepped back out of the alley, the damp Fleet Street fog swirling around him. The alley was empty. Yet, somewhere in that emptiness, a fatal terror had manifested. He considered the boy's cryptic claim. Arthur saw it in his music. Perhaps the key wasn't to look for a physical presence, but to understand the nature of the sound itself. If the weapon was the shriek, and the shriek was tied to the music, he needed to know what Arthur Penhaligon had been running from for the last decade of his life. With the Fleet Street mystery stalled, no killer, no weapon, only a dead man and a vanishing shriek, Inspector Caldwell turned his focus from the scene of the death to the life of the deceased. Arthur Penhaligon had been a fixture of the streets for over a decade, but no man simply appears out of the London fog. Caldwell dispatched a younger constable to the parish records and music unions, a task that quickly yielded a forgotten truth. Arthur Penhaligon was once a man of renown, not a mendicant fiddler. 10 years prior, before the accident that took his sight, he had been a highly promising, second-chair violinist in the prestigious London Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. His former colleagues, now contacted by the police, recalled Arthur with a mixture of pity and superstitious dread. He was described as a prodigy, a man who possessed a supernatural affinity for sound. He didn't just play music, he seemed to feel it with a rare, almost painful sensitivity. His promising career had been violently cleaved in two by a single, catastrophic event in 1879. His respectable lodgings, a quiet room in Bloomsbury, reflected this abandoned past. Caldwell found the room neat and sparse, but beneath the bed lay a locked trunk. Inside, instead of valuables, was a collection of old, crisp orchestral scores, many of them signed by composers. Tucked among them was a heavy, silver-framed photograph of a younger, vibrant Arthur, his eyes clear and full of life, posing proudly with a much finer, evidently expensive violin. One score stood out, a partially completed Requiem Massachusetts. It was not a published work, but a frantic set of handwritten musical notes by an obscure, long-dead European composer. The pages were heavily annotated in Arthur's own hand, not with technical notes, but with bizarre, cryptic warnings. "The low frequency feeds on the harmony," one margin read. Another warned, "Too close to the source. It sees with the bass." Caldwell realized Arthur hadn't been an ordinary blind fiddler. He was a man in exile, banished from his former life not just by blindness, but by a deeper terror connected to his talent. His street playing wasn't mere busking, it was a desperate, daily ritual, perhaps an attempt to keep his unique sensitivity sharp, or maybe, a means to ward off an unseen pursuer. The final piece of the puzzle lay in the one missing item from the trunk, the superb violin from the photograph. Where was it? Arthur had died with a cheap, battered instrument. The loss of his prized instrument, Caldwell concluded, must be directly linked to the traumatic event of 1879, the moment his sight was lost and his future was shattered. The street death on Fleet Street was not the beginning of the horror, but the terrible final chord of a decade-long retreat. Caldwell's investigation led him to the musty archives of the Royal London Opera House, where he unearthed the official records of the 1879 incident that had shattered Arthur Penhaligon's life. It was not a small fire or a simple stage mishap, it was a devastating structural collapse that occurred during a major performance, resulting in multiple injuries and one death. The records detailed that Arthur, then only 28, was in the orchestra pit, performing a crucial solo during the premiere of a modern symphony, the very piece mentioned in the cryptic annotations in his ledger. The piece was known for its deep, almost subterranean bass notes and a highly complex sonic structure. The collapse occurred just as Arthur hit a specific, high-pitched cadenza, a brilliant but difficult flourish. A section of the ceiling plaster, weakened by poor maintenance, dislodged and plummeted directly onto the orchestra pit. Several musicians were injured. Arthur, specifically, was struck on the head, which caused the optic nerve damage that eventually rendered him completely blind. Caldwell noted a chilling correlation. The collapse happened at the precise sonic climax of the piece. He interviewed the surviving orchestra manager, now an elderly, nervous man who still managed the venue. The manager recalled Arthur's strange behavior immediately following the accident, even before the full extent of his injury was known. "He wasn't crying for help, Inspector. He was shouting about the sound," the manager recounted, his voice trembling faintly. "He kept screaming that the music was too loud, that the bass notes were waking it up." He claimed the low frequency was not music but a vibration, a sound that could tear the structure apart. More disturbingly, the manager confirmed the loss of Arthur's original, prized violin. It wasn't destroyed in the collapse, it simply vanished from the pit during the chaos. Caldwell pieced together the fragments. Arthur, possessing a unique, perhaps extrasensory, sensitivity to sound, played a piece of music so powerful it reached a resonance frequency, a fatal note. This note didn't just damage the ceiling. Arthur believed it summoned or awakened something terrible, a low-frequency entity that now associated its presence with his music. He lost his sight and his instrument, but gained a terrifying awareness. The final piece he played on Fleet Street, the one Mr. Harrington described as a frenzy, was the same melody from the Opera House disaster, only played backward, scrambled, and sped up, a frantic blind man's attempt to use the killer's own call as a warning or a shield. The shriek from the alley was the sound of the entity finally answering his desperate performance. The investigation led Caldwell back to Arthur's meager lodgings in Bloomsbury. Tucked beneath the stack of annotated musical scores, he found a small, plain, cloth-bound book. It was not a conventional diary, it was the Journal of Sounds. This was the logbook of Arthur Penhaligon's private, post-blindness world. Written in a spidery, desperate hand, the journal contained no dates, only obsessive, detailed descriptions of sonic phenomena. Arthur had catalogued not the music he played, but the abnormal noises that pierced his enforced darkness. His heightened hearing, a terrible gift granted by the loss of his sight, had become a censor for things unseen. The entries were profoundly disturbing. They weren't musical terms, they were descriptions of non-human vibrations and textures. August. A low, wet hum, like a ship's hull turning in deep water. It smells of dust and ozone. Always present near the docks. I can feel the movement through the floorboards. It is listening to the city. November 1887. The whisper is back. It is not speech. It is the friction of something long and cold sliding over stone. I hear it best when the bells of St. Bride's stop chiming. It is seeking the harmony it hates. March. I played Purcell on the cheap fiddle. The higher notes seemed to repel it, creating a shimmering effect, like hot air. But the bass notes fed it. It grew louder, moving closer to the door. The journal revealed that Arthur's street playing was a daily, terrifying act of sonic defense. He wasn't begging, he was mapping the movement of an entity, or entities, that existed on a low frequency, one that music could either attract or temporarily repel. He had been living under siege for 10 years, battling an invisible menace with his bow and strings. Caldwell found the entry from the morning of Arthur's death. It was the longest, scrawled with a raw panic that had bled through the ink. It is here. Tonight. I heard the harmonic signature, the one from the opera house. It is searching for the source. The high notes drive it mad, but the moment of silence is its chance. I must play the final movement. I must complete the repulsion before it finds me. I feel its cold breath in the fog. The inspector now had a motive, a weapon, and a victim. Arthur Penhaligon was not killed randomly. He had knowingly engaged in a final, frantic battle with a sonic entity he had awakened a decade earlier. The shriek was not a murder cry. It was the sound of the entity closing the distance during the one moment of silence Arthur could not prevent. The man had died playing his own requiem. Caldwell now possessed the dead fiddler final puzzle piece, the sheet music from the opera house tragedy. He brought the complex score, along with Arthur's annotated journal, to a professor of musical theory at the Royal College of Music, a man known for his expertise in obscure, pre-Victorian compositions. The professor, initially dismissive, became unnerved as he analyzed the score and compared it to Arthur's final performance as described by Mr. Harrington. The symphony, the professor explained, contained a rarely used isochronic sequence in the bass line, a sustained rhythmic pulse that was meant to evoke the slow, grinding movement of planetary gears. The piece is structurally unsound, the professor declared, tapping a frantic cluster of notes in the requiem. It pushes the low frequencies right to the edge of what can be physically withstood. And this section here, he pointed to the specific cadenza Arthur was playing in 1879, is designed to clash with the bass pulse, creating an unstable harmonic resonance, a sonic vibration that could rattle the very foundations of a building. Caldwell then showed him the notes scribbled in Arthur's journal. The low frequency feeds on the harmony, and it sees with the bass. The professor grew pale. Mr. Penhaligon, with his extraordinary ear, must have been acutely aware of this resonance. He didn't just hear the music, he heard the vibration of the structure around him. When he played that final, soaring cadenza, he inadvertently hit the precise harmonic frequency needed to create the destructive sonic shockwave. But the true horror lay in the melody Arthur played on Fleet Street. Caldwell described the frantic, scrambled, almost panicked tune, and the professor's eyes widened. He sat down at a piano and slowly played the known fragments of the 1879 score. Then, combining those notes with the description of Arthur's desperate street playing, he reconstructed the final melody. "It's the reverse of the 1879 climax," the professor whispered, looking up at Caldwell. He was playing the destructive sequence backward, trying to unwind the vibration he had unleashed. It was an apotropaic charm, a desperate counterspell played on his violin. Arthur's final act was not a performance, it was an attempt at sonic exorcism. He was trying to push the entity, the low-frequency thing, away by reversing the sequence that had summoned it. He chose the spot near the alley because he had heard the whisper, the entity's presence, there. But the exorcism required a moment of complete silence to complete, and in that agonizing pause after the final stroke, the creature used the vacuum of sound to close the distance. The shriek from the alley was not the sound of a murder victim, but the sound of the sonic entity answering its summons and claiming the man who had dared to play with forces beyond human comprehension. Inspector Caldwell stood on Fleet Street, the site of the death, late on another foggy evening. He wasn't looking for evidence now, he was looking for confirmation. He held Arthur Penhaligon's Journal of Sounds, turning to the final, frantic entry. I must complete the repulsion before it finds me. I feel its cold breath in the fog. He understood Arthur's fatal plan. The blind fiddler hadn't been playing music, he'd been performing a desperate sonic ritual, the counter-melody, to drive away the low-frequency specter he had accidentally summoned years ago. The alley, with its impossible trackless smear on the wall, was the creature's portal, drawn to the powerful, resonant frequencies of Arthur's playing. Caldwell looked at the witnesses' former positions. Mr. Harrington, the Farnsworth sisters, and young Thomas were not observers of a crime. They were observers of a supernatural confrontation, shielded only by their inability to truly hear the sonic terror that afflicted Arthur. The inspector deduced that the fatal sequence played out like this. The summons. Arthur played the reversal melody, driving the creature back, but also drawing it to the alley's entrance. The repulsion failure, the final part of the counterspell, required a moment of silence. As the last note faded, the protective field of sound collapsed. The attack, the entity which Arthur described as a wet hum and a friction of something long and cold, used that split-second vacuum of sound to emerge from the alley. Its exit was the impossible, vertical smear on the wall. The shriek, the sound the witnesses heard, the mechanical failure, the breaking noise, was the sonic signature of the entity's materialization, the sound that his body, with its heightened sensitivity, registered as an absolute, life-ending horror. Arthur's last conscious act was plunging his nails into his violin, trying to physically tear the sound from the air, to silence the terrible truth of the creature's return. But it was too late. His heart, shocked by the sound and the sightless vision of the specter, simply gave out. As the fog thickened around Caldwell, the air grew noticeably colder, just as the witnesses had described. For a brief, terrifying moment, he felt a profound, low-frequency vibration rise up through the soles of his boots from the cobblestones. It was not a sound he heard with his ears, but a cold, sickening pulse that resonated in his chest, a deep, unsettling hum that seemed to speak of immense, unseen mass. Caldwell quickly withdrew from the spot, the chilling vibration receding as he moved. He had found his killer. It was a phenomenon, not a person. He couldn't arrest a sonic entity, and he certainly couldn't tell the coroner that Arthur Penhaligon was killed by a specter of unsound vibration. The official police report would state death by natural causes, induced by extreme psychological shock. But Caldwell knew the terrifying truth. The blind fiddler had seen his death in the sound, and the horror of the specter's reprise in the alley had silenced him forever.